The Lineage of Science, Isaac Newton, Norman Jones, and My Biomedical Journey Part 1, number 1650, May 20th, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, Category, Life Reflection. Preface, the Cambridge apple tree before my stroke, in late April 2025, I stood quietly beside the famous Newton apple tree at Trinity College, University of Cambridge. At that moment, I did not realize that only about 2 months later, I would suffer a hemorrhagic stroke that would bring me extremely close to death. At first glance, the photograph appears to be only a simple travel picture. However, after surviving the stroke and spending 11 months in recovery and reflection, it gradually realized that the image carried much deeper symbolic meaning. Section 1, Newton, Norman Jones, and scientific lineage. Emotionally, I have always felt surprisingly close to Isaac Newton through my professor, Norman Jones. Newton profoundly influenced the scientific tradition of the United Kingdom and eventually the entire world in terms of mathematics, physics, mechanics, dynamics, and systems thinking. More than 2 centuries later, Professor Norman Jones inherited that same engineering tradition and later taught me dynamic plasticity, energy transfer, structural response, nonlinear systems behavior, and impact mechanics at MIT during the early 1970s, although separated by nearly 300 years. The intellectual lineage emotionally felt very short to me. Isaac Newton gives scientific tradition of mathematics and physics, gives Norman Jones engineering and solid mechanics, gives myself biomedical systems and survival science. One was English, Professor Jones was British, I am Chinese American. Yet what connected all of us across centuries was not nationality, language, or politics. The connecting language was mathematics, physics, dynamics, engineering, and systems behavior. To me, this represented a kind of scientific knowledge lineage passed across many generations. That realization affected me deeply. Section 2, the deeper meaning behind Newton's apple. Famous apple story itself is actually less important than the deeper lesson behind it. Many people saw apples falling from trees. Newton's greatness came from continuously asking deeper questions. Why does the apple fall? What invisible force governs motion? Can the same laws explain both earthly motion and planetary motion? Newton moved beyond isolated observations and searched for the hidden laws governing the universal system. That way of thinking deeply influenced modern science and engineering. Through Professor Jones, it also deeply influenced me. I recently watched a historical English learning video regarding Isaac Newton on YouTube. What interested me most was not the English story itself, but the deeper human story hidden underneath the narration. The video repeatedly described Newton as a quiet, lonely, deeply reflective thinker who continuously observed nature while asking simple but profound questions. That description emotionally resonated with me very strongly. The video emphasized Newton's quiet years during the Great Plague, when Cambridge University temporarily closed and Newton returned home. During those isolated years, he quietly developed foundational ideas regarding gravity, optics, calculus, and motion that eventually changed the scientific world forever. What impressed me was not merely his intelligence, but the combination of solitude, continuous observation, deep concentration, and long-term systems thinking. In many ways, I emotionally understood that process through Professor Norman Jones, my advisor. Section 3, from engineering dynamics to biomedical systems. Beginning around 2010. Long before CGM Libra systems and wearable health ecosystems became common, I had already started collecting extensive longitudinal biomedical data from my own body. I use finger stick blood glucose measurements, body weight scales, manual blood pressure devices, food intake records, walk meters for exercise data, watches for sleep records, and continuous lifestyle details tracking to study long-term pathophysiological TRAJCTORIS. At that time, and even today, most medical doctors still view medical data primarily through isolated clinical snapshots from quarterly laboratory tests, a blood test, a clinic visit, a quarterly HbA1c, or a single MRI image if necessary. However, from my 4 decades of mathematics and engineering background, isolated snapshots have always carried very limited meaning. I need curves, particularly trajectory curves, to understand the true insights hidden within biomedical information. What truly matters is the continuous images from a movie, including trajectory, direction, acceleration, instability, oscillation, cumulative damage, recovery, and long-term evolution over time. And fortunately, and truthfully, living biomedical systems behave dynamically, not statically. This way of thinking came naturally to me because of my academic background. And dynamic systems. One isolated data point rarely explains the true and entire system behavior. The trajectory reveals much deeper truth than the snapshot. A single glucose reading means little. A single blood pressure reading means little. Even a single MRI image means little by itself. Only the evolving trajectory over months and years reveals the true behavior of the biomedical system, including organs, tissues, and cells. In addition, big data from lifestyle details such as diet, exercise, hydration, sleep, emotional stress, and medication reactions can often reveal the hidden truth regarding their causal relationships with collected biomarkers. This perspective came directly from systems of mathematics, physics, engineering, mechanics, dynamic plasticity, viscoplasticity, and nonlinear systems analysis. Section for Norman Jones and viscoplastic mechanics. Professor Norman Jones specialized in dynamic plasticity and structural energy behavior. His work focused not on static snapshots, but on how systems evolve dynamically under stress, impact, accumulation, deformation, and changing boundary conditions. Despite the fact that fluid mechanics had utilized viscosity concepts much earlier, Professor Norman Jones further extended Newton's viscosity concept into solid mechanics by calculating the strain rate, meaning the rate of deformation change over time. This additional step revealed the hidden truth of viscoplastic behavior inside physical structures, both liquid and solid. In short, historically, viscosity concepts were first applied to fluid mechanics. Later, researchers gradually extended these time-dependent deformation ideas into solid mechanics. Traditional solid mechanics mainly focused on elastic and plastic stress-strain behavior. Viscoplasticity later introduced strain rate effects, delayed deformation, energy dissipation, and dynamic evolution behavior into solid structures. Professor Norman Jones became one of the first and important researchers extending these concepts into dynamic plasticity and impact engineering. Section 5A. Delayed understanding of viscoplasticity. Jones's own academic journey was also very interesting to me. Professor Jones was born in Liverpool and raised in southern England. He later attended the University of Manchester and obtained his PhD in mechanical engineering. After completing his doctorate, he moved to the United States and became an assistant professor at Georgia Institute of Technology. Later he moved to Brown University as an associate professor, where he continued working on some of the early engineering applications involving dynamic plasticity theory. Eventually he moved to MIT sometime during the late 1960s, a few years before I entered MIT in 1972. By the time I arrived, he was already a full professor. I later imitated Professor Jones's academic career progression in my professional industrial world, advancing from an entry-level assistant engineer to the CEO of a high-tech firm. In the early 1970s, Professor Jones was already exploring the viscous plastic behavior of dynamic systems. However, during my 5 or 6 years under his guidance at MIT, the viscosity portion was still mainly a research subject rather than a formal classroom teaching topic. Therefore, although I learned dynamic plasticity, energy behavior, and nonlinear systems thinking from him, I did not study the viscosity portion deeply until the recent 6 years. From 2021 through 2026, Section 6 Application of Viscosity through Medical Research. Decades later, around the end of 2020, Professor Jones called me from England to remind me about the application of the viscosity component into my medical research work. That reminder unexpectedly reopened an entire intellectual pathway inside my mind. I then spent nearly 1 year refreshing the viscosity theory of physics by myself. The actual relearning process was extremely time-consuming. I manually performed countless calculations using Excel spreadsheets and wrote several hundred biomedical research papers largely through longhand calculations and numerical analysis in order to deeply understand and memorize the minute details of viscoplasticity in my brain, eventually turning it into my second nature. This process is important for transforming mathematical concepts into deep physical understanding. During this journey, I finally came to fully appreciate the contributions made by both Isaac Newton and Norman Jones. Eventually, after enormous effort, I finally integrated many of these mathematical formulations, such as normalization, strain-stress-energy calculations, and graphics generation, into my own medical AI software system on my iPhone, making the calculations much faster and more practical. What previously required hours of manual work has now been reduced to about 2 seconds. Therefore, I could devote far more time to interpreting my research results instead of spending most of my effort on computational work. Looking backward now, I gradually realized something very important. Much of my biomedical systems thinking was fundamentally built upon what Norman Jones taught me 5 decades earlier at MIT. The full realization of those taught concepts of viscoplastic energy methodology came late in my life, approximately 55 years after first meeting Professor Jones. When we are young, we often learn equations, methods, and theories without fully understanding their deeper meaning. However, after decades of engineering design, business experience, chronic disease, suffering, survival aging, and self-observation, I gradually began to understand the true depth and power behind those great physics and engineering concepts. In other words, my deeper and better understanding of some parts of physics and engineering gradually came from applying those theoretical principles to biomedicine. The human body itself behaves like a nonlinear dynamic system under continuous stress, accumulation, deformation, compensation, recovery, and instability. The only major difference lies in the material itself, organic in medicine versus inorganic in engineering. The mathematics may look similar on the surface, but the underlying material behavior, feedback loops, adaptability, repair mechanisms, and instability patterns are very different between medicine and engineering. Engineering systems are usually designed, founded, and relatively predictable. Human biomedical systems are self-adaptive, self-repairing, compensatory, emotionally influenced, hormonally coupled, and constantly changing over time. In engineering, material properties are usually measurable and stable. In medicine, the material itself is alive and continuously evolving. Nevertheless, physics and engineering are still capable of offering some deeper insights that linear statistical methods are unable to provide. That realization transformed engineering mechanics into my biomedical survival science. Section 7. Reconnecting with Professor Jones. Around the early 1980s, Professor Jones eventually returned to England, partly because his wife was British and missed their home country. He joined the University of Liverpool, where he built a major dynamic laboratory and continued his research for many decades. He remained extremely dedicated and single-minded toward engineering truth throughout his entire career. Over time, he established himself as one of the world's leading authorities in dynamic plasticity and impact engineering. I left MIT around 1976 and became deeply involved in my own engineering jobs and high-tech business career. For many years, I was extremely busy building startup companies, experiencing 7 failures along the way, including work involving portable PC hardware, linguistics, AI modeling, mechanical kit systems, semiconductor chip design, automation software, managing thousands of engineers, and surviving intense business competition and legal attacks. As a result, I lost direct contact with Professor Jones for many years. Then around 1995, after I finally achieved significant business success, I began reviewing my own life journey more deeply and thoughtfully. I then realized that 2 university professors in the United States had fundamentally changed both my way of thinking and my professional career, Professor James Andrews at Iowa and Professor Norman Jones at MIT. That realization motivated me to reconnect with Professor Jones. Since reconnecting in 1995, we have never lost contact again. As I became older, and especially after my biomedical research intensified after 2010, I genuinely and increasingly appreciated his deep influence on my professional thinking, research direction, and eventually even my business success. I began traveling back to the United Kingdom regularly to visit him, sometimes every year, sometimes every 2 years, continuously over many years. Each time I visited him, I increasingly realized how profoundly his systems thinking had shaped my own intellectual framework. This is part 1.